The lemon cake was still on the counter when they found the door open. On the evening of October 14, 1963, in the Kingsbridge neighborhood of the Bronx, New York, population just shy of 30,000 souls, packed into row houses and corner groceries and streets where children played until the streetlights came on that October evening. A neighbor named Dolores Fuentes stepped across the narrow strip of sidewalk between her stoop and the one next door, carrying a covered dish for a birthday that would never happen. She knocked. The door swung inward on its own. She called out. Nobody answered. But inside, on the kitchen counter, was a lemon cake that had been frosted that same afternoon. Still cool, still whole. A single candle pressed into the center, unlit. What happened in the next 12 hours would haunt Kingsbridge for the next 61 years. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the beginning. Because to understand what was lost on that October night, you first have to understand who Margaret Elaine Russo was. Margaret was 34 years old. She stood 5 feet 2 inches in her Sunday shoes, and she had the kind of laugh that carried down a whole block. People in Kingsbridge said you always knew when Maggie was at a block party, because you could hear her before you saw her. She worked 5 days a week as a bookkeeper at a printing house on Jerome Avenue, kept the numbers in her head the way other people kept recipes. And every Friday, without exception, she brought home a small paper bag of pastries from the Italian bakery on Fordham Road. One for herself, one for her mother, who lived 2 doors down, and one for whoever needed it that week. She had been married once, briefly, to a man named Vincent, who had left in 1958 and was never discussed again. She had no children. What she had instead was a neighborhood, a whole network of people who borrowed her good saucepan and told her their troubles on the front stoop in summer, and knew that if something went wrong at 2 in the morning, Margaret Russo's light would come on. In October of 1963, the Kingsbridge neighborhood of the Bronx was the kind of place that still believed in itself. The Dominican Republic had just changed governments. President Kennedy was 2 weeks from Dallas. On the radio that autumn, Bobby Vinton was singing Blue Velvet, and families gathered around black and white televisions to watch Walter Cronkite read the evening news like a civic duty. Kingsbridge had its corner mass, and its corner bar, and its corner argument about the Yankee season, and Margaret Russo was woven into all of it. Her 34th birthday was October 14th. She had been planning the small gathering for weeks, a handful of neighbors, her mother, her best friend Carol Anselmo from 3 blocks over. She had made the lemon cake herself that afternoon. She had left it on the counter to cool. That evening, at approximately 6:15, a neighbor named Raymond Halcott saw Margaret standing on her front stoop talking with someone. He waved. She waved back. He went inside. That was the last time anyone who loved her saw Margaret Russo alive. By 7 o'clock that evening, her mother had called 3 times. No answer. By 7:30, Carol Anselmo had walked over and stood on the stoop knocking. No answer. By 8, Dolores Fuentes had crossed the sidewalk with her covered dish, pushed open the door that was already unlatched, and found the kitchen exactly as it had been left. The cake on the counter, a carving knife in the drying rack, 2 cups set out for coffee. Margaret was gone. The first officers arrived at 9:47 p.m. They walked the apartment. No sign of a struggle. No forced entry at the windows. The front door had been unlocked from the inside, which meant Margaret, or someone she knew, had opened it. Sergeant Dominic Perella of the 50th Precinct took the initial report. He noted the birthday setup. He noted the unlit candle. He noted the 2 cups for coffee, as if she had been expecting someone before the gathering began. By midnight, when the neighbors had gathered on the stoops in coats and the October cold had settled in across the Bronx, the search had already begun. Perella walked the alley behind the row of houses. He shone his light into the narrow gap between number 42 and number 44. He found a woman's shoe. Just one. Navy blue, low heel, the kind Margaret had been wearing when Raymond Halcott saw her on the stoop at 6:15. One shoe. The second was never found. Not that night. Not that year. Not for 60 years. The investigation that followed was led by Detective Frank Callahan, a 12-year veteran of the Bronx who had worked homicide since 1956 and who wore the same brown suit 3 days out of 5 and kept a small photograph of his own daughter taped to his desk lamp in a way that everyone at the precinct understood without ever mentioning. Callahan began with the neighborhood, a canvas of every person on the block, every person who knew Margaret, every person who had seen anything in the window of time between 6:15 and 9:47. Records show that Callahan's notes from the first 48 hours fill 11 pages. He spoke to 22 individuals. He returned to 7 of them more than once. The first suspect was Margaret's ex-husband, Vincent Russo. He was located within 4 days at an address in Queens. He had remarried. He had 2 small children. He had an alibi that was verified by 3 witnesses at a diner in Flushing, where he had eaten dinner that evening. He was eliminated within the week. The second suspect was a man named Gerald Pratt, who had lived 2 buildings down from Margaret and who had made remarks to her on more than one occasion that other neighbors described, in Callahan's interview notes, as unwelcome and aggressive. Pratt was brought in for questioning twice. He denied everything. He had no alibi Callahan could confirm. But he had also, and this would matter, later, moved out of Kingsbridge entirely in November of 1963, just 3 weeks after Margaret disappeared. At the time, Callahan flagged it. He flagged it and then watched it disappear into a bureaucratic drain, because Margaret Russo had not yet been confirmed as a homicide. She was a missing person. And missing persons, in 1963, did not always command the attention of a precinct stretched thin across a borough. Margaret's mother, Rosa Russo, went to the precinct herself in January of 1964. Records show she waited 2 hours before anyone would speak to her. She was told that the case was open. She was told they were pursuing leads. She was given no names, no timelines, no answers. She walked home in the cold to a neighborhood where people had begun, slowly and without meaning to be cruel, to speak of her daughter in the past tense. The years accumulated the way winter does in New York, one gray layer at a time, one season pressing down on the one before it. By 1970, 7 years had passed, and Margaret Russo's name appeared in exactly one active case file at the 50th Precinct, a folder, thin now, with a cover note from Detective Callahan, who had retired in 1968 and left a single handwritten memo attached to the front page. It read, "The Pratt lead was never properly closed. Someone should go back." Nobody went back. By 1978, 15 years after Margaret's disappearance, Rosa Russo had aged a decade for every year. She kept a photograph of her daughter in a frame on the mantelpiece, and she kept, beside it, the small paper bag from the Fordham Road bakery that Margaret had brought home the Friday before she vanished, still unopened, still bearing the grease stain of a pastry that had long since turned to nothing. She couldn't throw it away. Anyone who visited the apartment understood why without being told. By 1988, 25 years on, Carol Anselmo, Margaret's best friend, the one who had walked 3 blocks in the dark to knock on that stoop, had moved to New Jersey and had 3 children and a grandchild on the way. She still called Rosa Russo every October 14th. She still asked the same question. She still received the same answer. Nothing new. But the call meant the world. And everyone in this story knew it. The detective's memo stayed in its folder. Gerald Pratt, who had moved to Nassau County in 1963, had quietly lived out a life in a small house in Levittown, a house he bought in 1965, a house he maintained, a house where neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept his lawn neat and arrived at the diner every Saturday morning at the same hour, and always sat alone in the corner booth, and always paid in cash. He had never married. He had no record. He had no reason, as far as anyone looking at him from the outside could see, to be afraid of anything. Then, in 2022, something happened that no one, except perhaps, somewhere in a place that defies explanation. Rosa Russo, who had died in 2004 still waiting, had entirely given up hoping for. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, digging through public records, cross-referencing case files, and piecing together lives that deserved more than what they got. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Margaret. In the spring of 2022, the New York State Police Cold Case Unit received a routine request from a genealogical DNA database. The request was not routine. It was the result of a process that had begun 18 months earlier, when a civilian genealogist named Patricia Okonkwo, working as a contractor for a nonprofit that specializes in cold cases with biological evidence, had obtained authorization to upload a degraded DNA sample collected from beneath Margaret Russo's fingernails in 1963 and preserved in a state evidence locker for 6 decades to a public ancestry platform. Detective Serena Voss of the NISP Cold Case Unit read the results on a Tuesday morning in March. She read them once. Then she pulled up a satellite map of Nassau County. Then she picked up the phone. The process works by uploading crime scene DNA to the same ancestry databases that ordinary people use to trace their family histories, cross-referencing partial matches against thousands of family trees until the software narrows the possible contributors to a single branch, then a single name. It is painstaking work. It can take months. In this case, it took 14 months. The name it produced was Gerald Thomas Pratt, now 81 years old, still living in Levittown, still in the corner booth every Saturday morning. Voss called the Nassau County Sheriff's Office. She pulled Callahan's original case file, the one with the handwritten note still attached to the front. She read it standing at her desk, in the middle of a cold case unit that had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something that has been waiting a very long time finally arrives. The Pratt lead was never properly closed. Someone was about to go back. Gerald Pratt had lived 20 minutes from the Bronx for 61 years. He had attended 2 neighborhood block parties. He had once sat on a homeowners association board. He had been photographed at a local church fundraiser in 1987, standing in the back row, hands folded, looking at nothing in particular. He was described by neighbors in Levittown as quiet, private, no trouble at all. He had never, in 6 decades, given anyone in Nassau County a reason to knock on his door with a warrant. But in Kingsbridge, in 1963, he had been different. He had been the man on the block who watched Margaret Russo from across the street, who had spoken to her in a way that made her uncomfortable, who had, according to one neighbor whose statement sat buried in Callahan's file for 59 years, been seen walking toward the alley behind Margaret's row house on the evening of October 14th. That statement had been collected. It had been filed. It had never been followed up. On the morning of April 4, 2022, two investigators from the Nassau County Sheriff's Office and Detective Serena Voss knocked on Gerald Pratt's door in Levittown at 7:14 a.m. He opened it in his bathrobe. He looked at the badges. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I've been waiting for this." He did not resist. He did not run. He had been waiting, by his own account, for 61 years. The DNA from beneath Margaret Rousseau's fingernails matched Gerald Thomas Pratt with a probability exceeding 99.98%. Court documents confirmed that additional trace evidence recovered from his clothing at the time of arrest, fibers consistent with the coat Margaret had been wearing on the night of October 14, 1963, would be introduced at preliminary hearing. The community reaction to the arrest was not disbelief. It was something more complicated than that. The people who had known Margaret, and there were fewer of them every year now, older men and women in their 80s and 90s who still remembered her laugh, her pastry bags, her unlit birthday candle, did not feel shock. They felt something closer to the settling of a bone that had been broken for a very long time. A sick, quiet relief that the world had finally corrected itself. However late, Carol Anselmo, now 80, was reached by phone by a reporter from a Bronx community newspaper. She said 4 words before she began to cry. Maggie deserved better. Gerald Pratt was charged with murder in the 2nd degree. He entered a plea of guilty in October 2023, 60 years and 1 week after the night he had walked across a narrow strip of sidewalk and into the life of a woman who had done nothing in this world except make it warmer. He was sentenced to time already considered served pending custodial medical review, given his age and health. He would not die in prison. That fact sits, for the people who loved Margaret, the way unresolved things sit, not peacefully, but permanently. Part of the record now, unable to be undone. There is a photograph of Margaret Rousseau taken in the summer of 1963. 3 months before she died. She is standing on the stoop of her building on a bright afternoon, wearing a cotton dress and squinting into the sun, and she is laughing at something happening off to the left of the frame. Her hand is raised to shade her eyes. She looks like someone who has somewhere to be after this. Something good waiting. She looks the way people look when they are in the middle of their life without knowing it. That is the photograph that Carol Anselmo kept on her dresser for 6 decades. That is the photograph that ran in the Bronx paper when the arrest was announced. That is who Margaret Rousseau was, and who she still is to the people who refused to let her name fade into the silence that Gerald Pratt had counted on. She wanted to bake a cake. She wanted to share it with the people who loved her. She wanted to turn 34 on a Tuesday in October in the Bronx, in a neighborhood that knew her name. That is what was taken. The DNA from beneath her fingernails, the marks she left on the man who killed her, the only evidence she had time to leave, waited 61 years in an evidence locker for the technology to arrive that could finally read what she had written. And it did arrive, and it did read it. Justice, in this case, was not fast. It was not clean. It was not everything it should have been. But it came. What does it mean that a woman had to wait 61 years for the law to take her seriously? What does it mean that a handwritten note in a retired detective's file, the Pratt lead was never properly closed, sat untouched for 59 years, while the man it named drank coffee in a diner 20 minutes away every Saturday morning? And what do we owe to the people who never gave up? Rosa Rousseau at the precinct window in January of 1964. Carol Anselmo calling every October 14th. Patricia Okonkwo at her desk with a 60-year-old DNA sample and a database that didn't exist when Margaret Rousseau was alive. Leave your thoughts below. And tell us, was this justice? Or is justice something that has to arrive in time to mean what it's supposed to mean? Justice found Margaret Rousseau after 61 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More stories are waiting in the description. Thank you for being here.